day 3 of the government-mandated lockdown. It is a gorgeous spring day outside, and none of us are really allowed to go out and enjoy it. We are all stuck in our homes, already getting frustrated. So instead of just sitting around, we thought we would bring in some of our big brains that we are lucky enough to have contributing and writing for us at Unheard, and see if we can get a discussion going of the bigger questions of how this might affect the world, what it makes you think about the way we run our society, and those kinds of things. So I am delighted to be joined today. Hopefully you can see some of these wonderful people. First of all, we have David Goodhart down on the bottom row. David, give us a wave. Next to David, we have Liz Oldfield, joining us down the line from Hampshire. And next to me on the top is Zoe Strimpel, author and also Unheard contributor. So we're going to start, let me just remember to say, please do use Twitter, or if you're watching this on Facebook to write in any comments and questions, and we will try and feed them in, since this is actually live. That's the idea of doing it live. And as you'll see, internet connections are slightly varying in quality, and people might cut in and cut out, but let's see how we go. David and Liz, first of all. Liz, you wrote a piece for us, which we published earlier today, asking whether the kind of shutdown, as it's already happened, might be having positive effects on the environment, and whether it might make us think differently about the big kind of green questions. Do you feel that there's going to be positive side effects of this?
So I think we need to be very careful about talking about positive side effects right now. I'm sure many of you will have seen the, frankly, kind of anti-humanist rhetoric coming from some fringe rogue elements of the climate movement about the human beings being the disease and the virus being the cure. And I'm very nervous of all of that. However, I do think in the same way it will affect many things, this moment opens up huge opportunities for change, and that could go in 2 directions. We know that we are in a climate emergency, that we have some already incredibly ambitious targets to hit in order to preserve a livable environment for human beings. And we could see, because of the rapid change that's come about in economies, in travel, we could see an opportunity to just commit to those faster, to see what is possible, to think more creatively about what's important to us. Or we could see post-economic crash, which is clearly in process, governments so understandably desperate to boost economies in order to pull the poorest that will have been pushed into poverty by the desecration of jobs, just relying on tried and tested methods, using stimulus packages that privilege fossil industries, bailing out airlines, all of those things which are completely understandable but would be catastrophic for us all in the long term, because things like pandemics are related to the climate crisis. We've had fire, we've had flood, we've had plague this year. It's getting pretty biblical. Let's pause and just be very clear-sighted about how we accelerate out of this.
Can I ask, Liz, you mentioned a kind of the biblical feeling, and I think a lot of people will feel that it feels like a sort of pestilence. In the piece you wrote for us this morning, you referred to Israel in exile in Babylon in the Bible, and there's a line from it which you quoted: "The land enjoyed its Sabbath rest." So there's almost a sense that it's sort of meant to be, or that you hear that a lot talking to people. Kind of normally, there's some sense of what the message of this crisis in some way, or that it's pointing us in a particular direction. Is that just us creating narratives, or do you feel that sort of the world is speaking to us in some way?
I mean, I think human beings are always creating narratives, but going back to the text, the land enjoyed its Sabbath. It's such a powerful line, and it's because the Mosaic law that the nation of Israel was supposed to be obeying built in rhythms of work and rest for people, for animals, and the land, and it respected the limits of us as individuals, for what we owe to each other, for the network of relationships which included creation. And one way to read it is that part of what's happening in the exile is overdue Sabbaths, and that actually there is something that nature needs to have its limits respected too. I think that this pandemic is our fault, and the way that it spread is our fault. I think that if it helps us to reflect on our limits and the land's limits and what we owe to each other, and take that moment of Sabbath, which is not just about kind of economic, is not just about individual rest, but is about economic rhythms and patterns that respect justice, that respect how assets are allocated, all these kind of things, a kind of jubilee moment alongside the suffering and death, which we rightly should grieve for and mourn, and not kind of overlay with false optimism. But there is something as we move through this that could restore us to a better rhythm.
Okay, let me bring in David. I've heard, David, I'm not sure whether those were grunts of approval or disapproval, but I heard something coming over the loudspeaker. What's your reaction to what Liz has said, David?
I do think that we all have to be a bit careful of corona confirmation bias. That, you know, we all see in the crisis the confirmation of what we believed going into the crisis. It'll all be more so what we believed. I mean, having said that, I do think kind of what I believe is going to be reinforced after the crisis, which is the sort of, in a way, the sort of common sense description of where politics, not just in Britain, but sort of throughout the West, has been going in the last few years. As a kind of response to populism, we've been moving a little bit to the left economically and a little bit to the right culturally. And it seems pretty obvious that is indeed going to be reinforced. This is a crisis of hyperconnectivity. We were already into a degree of deglobalization. I mean, world trade has been falling in recent years. We will have some reshoring. We will build more resilience and self-sufficiency into our systems. And many of those things are things that the environmentalists want as well. I think there's always in a way been that rather sort of peculiar marriage in some ways of the sort of impulses behind at least the more kind of moderate and sensible wing of populism and environmentalism. I mean, both of them in a way are saying, you know, let's get off the hamster wheel to some extent.
So David, I like what you're saying there, because actually it's something we've written a lot about as well, which is the sort of resonance between the kind of environmental left instinct and a kind of like wholesome instinct, which you see a lot on the right, which, you know, it's kind of like that Crunchy Cons book that is now 10 or 15 years old, which described this kind of particular kind of conservative that is sort of quite open-toed sandals and into nature and into living simply and virtuously, and actually is quite similar to a kind of Extinction Rebellion character. And you know, that is an interesting resonance, and maybe that could be a sort of new political alliance in the future. Liz?
Yeah, I was reading Roger Scruton on the environment this morning, revisiting some of his writing on it, including the beauty report that he wrote just before he died. And he had a line where he said the three priorities of the conservative movement: transgenerational loyalty, the priority of the local, and the search for home, which I just thought was a beautiful way of describing the conservative project, are utterly and naturally aligned with a concern of environmentalism, of the preservation of nature, of creation. And so I think it's really important in this moment to reflect the way that talking about climate change as we go into a very high anxiety time can polarize us politically, but it doesn't have to, that it can be something that we are committed to across the divides.
Can I just try and play the skeptic for a moment with both of Liz and David here? Whether it's a kind of reversion to a more national level of government and a kind of reshoring of production lines, which is what David was talking about, or it's this kind of like flying around less and basically doing less that Liz was talking about. You know, is that really a future that we can get either excited about or people are going to kind of rush towards. If the sort of headline is do less, move around less, don't see foreign lands as much, don't be as interconnected, all of that rhetoric is very inspiring and positive to people. It doesn't sound much fun. Am I wrong?
So one, I would challenge the interconnectedness. I have felt exhaustingly interconnected over the last 3 days with people all over the world, having not left this square footage. I also think, and we need to very much acknowledge, this is not the case for everyone. This is not the case for frontline health workers. This is not the case for food delivery. This is not the case for the startlingly, suddenly high value people in our society who are just in survival mode. But for a lot of others, I feel many people expressing a sense of relief that the stripping away, the clarifying of what's important that comes through crisis. The word apocalypse means an unveiling of who we are and what we're doing and what we care about. And yes, we love to travel, but this sense of we care about community, we care about valuing the vulnerable and the precious, and we care about living as if we really do owe things to each other. And that's incredibly heartening to see.
David?
Well, I think you're right. Probably in the short term, I mean, when the crisis recedes, we'll probably travel more. I mean, we'll all kind of want to let our hair down and get out even more. But as Liz says, I think this is a period of kind of taking stock. Like I say, of sort of getting off the hamster wheel for a short period. And this is not a crisis of capitalism. Capitalism didn't cause the crisis, but it has revealed some of the weaknesses in the way that we currently do lots of things, including running our health service sort of on a just-in-time basis, which we should never have been doing. I mean, Liz says that this is our fault. This is not our fault, this virus, but our failure to prepare for it certainly is. And we will be better prepared in the future. We will have more cushion in the system. And it's also revealed the kind of hidden wiring of who we're dependent on. I mean, the list of key workers is very, very revealing. I mean, it's the kind of people that were right at the bottom of the pile, and who've now acquired suddenly a kind of new respect. The people that that fill the shelves in supermarkets and keep the food and the pharmaceutical supply chains going, driving lorries and so on. I mean,
David,
yeah.
I mean, I think I completely agree with that, and I think the realizations that it helps us reach are really important. I just want to kind of reiterate this question, which for me is one of the hardest ones to answer, which is, how do you sell this vision? Whether you talk about community or home or valuing the right kind of workers and all of these, it doesn't sound fun. So I'm just really interested how imagine that it's 2 months, let's say, optimistically, maybe it's more longer than that, that these sort of house arrest is lifted and everyone can go out. What message can you have to people when newly released from incarceration that says, don't forget what was good about the imprisoned period. Let's try and retain some of those things now and not go all individualistic and so on in the future. Do you have a message? Do you have a messaging plan for this?
Well, I mean, hyperglobalization, isn't much fun either in a way. It's kind of frenetic and you travel all around the world, but you take yourself with you. When you arrive somewhere, you're still with yourself. I think it will encourage a little bit more thoughtfulness, mindfulness, and all of that.
There was a tweet on there was the beginnings of a little Twitter spat between you and Ian Birrell earlier, another one of our contributors, when he objected to something you had written in your piece about the cliche that viruses don't respect borders, and you responded to that actually, viruses are contained within people, and they have to respect borders. So borders can.
Yeah, I mean, presumably Ian thinks it's quite sensible to reduce mobility in the UK. So how he can oppose limiting movement across borders when he's in favour of hugely limiting it within borders? I mean, that was just silly, I think.
But it goes to the same messaging point, doesn't it? Because Ian, who was actually on our -1 show, he came and did a pilot with us. He would self-describe as a liberal. He believes in a kind of globalized world, and he has reluctantly, I think, definitely revised his view on China, for example. And he was telling us how he really thinks we need to recalibrate our relationship with China, and he thinks they do have a lot to answer for this crisis. But then, faced with your kind of comment, he still felt that was too far. The world that he talks about still sounds sort of more virtuous, really, doesn't it? It's an open, borderless, kind of embracing kind of society. Do you?
Well, yeah, but I mean that's always had huge limitations and huge cost, or the costs and benefits of that very open world have been very unevenly distributed. And this will surely give a shove, against cosmopolitanism. I mean, cosmopolitanism was always a very, very minority faith anyway. And was something sort of enjoyed by a very small proportion of people. We now know that too much openness. We know even more clearly that too much openness is positively dangerous, because this is clearly just a warning shot, isn't it?
Let's bring in Liz. I just see Liz had a hand up. Liz, what's your reaction?
Yeah, I think we need to be careful not to conflate personal choices post-lockdown with long-term environmental action. People flying less as individuals is not going to fix this. This absolutely has to be government level, international level transition of energy markets. It has to be the European Green New Deal or something similar. Us all deciding to fly 10% less when we get out of lockdown isn't going to change this. However, I do think there is a really interesting moment philosophically, and I am finding this sense of clarifying of values, of clarifying of virtues of what we really want. And if you look at the research about well-being, about mental health, yes, we can look back with rosy-tinted spectacles at the time when we could all go to the pub and the cinema at whatever time. But if you look at the data, it's clear that our well-being wasn't necessarily thriving under that. And so I think there's a moment to look to tell a different story that does prioritize human value, relationships, and connectedness. And I think that needs to be both local and global. I'm not quite so anti-cosmopolitanism as David is, although I understand the risks of it. But yes, there's a kind of individual philosophical, ethical moment to help us. But without the government action, nothing's going to change.
Can we? I don't know if this is possible, but can we bring in Zoe as well? Do we have a group?
So twitching away.
Zoe, you have been very patiently listening to this, and when we've been talking about internationalism and cosmopolitanism, you have just been repatriated from Australia, where, as I understand it, you were planning to spend a whole longer period and then had to hotfoot at home because of the coronavirus. What's your perspective listening to this discussion?
Well, so my perspective is perhaps more free market, unfettered, although that's not entirely my political position, than these two, in the sense that for me, this virus has been an opportunity to think about how brilliant aspects of modern freedom, the aviation industry, the freedom to, traverse the globe, all the kind of incredible freedoms that we've enjoyed very specifically as a result of the way kind of markets have developed in various ways. Are you
missing those freedoms more now that they're taken away?
Well, of course. I mean, the argument that, maybe we are better off now that we can't go to the pub. In some ways that might be true, but you do see how you can creep into a sort of nanny state authority. I can absolutely tell you that as someone who took very seriously the opportunity to go to Australia for a month, who planned many things around it. It's not trivial. I think the freedom to travel is actually a profound thing. And so I think, yes, I mean, I absolutely am not in this camp of, oh, it's great that we get to take stock and think about community and kinship. I would like to take stock of how brilliant it is that we have had these amazing freedoms that are now hideously being curtailed. I mean, for good reason, and it could be worse. It's not the Blitz. We're kind of doing all right. Those of us who are lucky enough still to be kind of not touched by tragedy.
I should just say, Zoe, for a period, you went green, and then I believe you turned into a slideshow, which you probably would not have been aware of, but the viewers might have been a little bit confused. You became a series of fireworks, and then people in protective masks. But now you're back. So we hear you again, and we heard you. David,
yeah, the connection.
David, having heard Zoe there, this is the counter argument, isn't it?
Well, no, I mean these are all sort of false extremes, aren't they? I mean, no one is suggesting that there are going to be restrictions on personal freedoms or the ability to travel. Well, I mean, there may be, the Green movement has already attached some social stigma to, I don't know, getting into an aeroplane 4 or 5 times a month. It's something that probably people who do that feel a bit guilty about it in a way they didn't.
Do you feel guilty if you travel far or travel often?
Sorry, do I?
Yeah. Do you feel guilty if you have to go to a faraway country, or you have to do a lot?
Well, because I don't travel that much. I do travel a bit, but I mean, like I say, I mean, these are sort of extremes that no one is proposing or going to propose. I mean, it's a matter of sort of dialing up and dialing down, sort of at the margin on things. I mean, that's kind of how most social change happens, and what traces this experience will leave behind. We're not going to, Boris Johnson isn't going to turn into kind of Oliver Cromwell and stop us going to the pub or getting on an aeroplane to Sydney.
He technically has stopped us going to the pub already.
Well, that's true, but I mean, we were kind of doing that voluntarily. But he hasn't banned maypoles. So can we dance around a maypole with one other person?
Well, there you have it. That's the answer, everyone. We have a scoop from David Goodhart that actually dancing around the maypole in sets of 2 is going to be the new national pastime in these peak times. I'm keen to move on, if we can, to what we were going to talk to Zoe about. Liz and David, if you are able to stick around, that would be amazing. And please shout in if you're upset about anything we're saying. But if you have to go, we totally understand.
All right.
Zoe.
Yeah, I missed what you said. Am I visible, or am I just sort of a strange...
You are visible once again. There was a period where you turned into a slideshow, but
yes.
You are now visible again.
Excellent.
So
great.
What we were going to talk about with you is we had a review of your new book on Unheard this morning, and it's all about dating and love in modern Britain. Mm-hmm. Do you think, I suppose a development of what we were just talking about, do you think the kind of highly individualistic, kind of marketized dating that we are now used to is going to be sort of increased or dampened down by long term by these kind of coronavirus experience?
I mean, it's really interesting. I can't see the basic structures that underpin kind of contemporary dating changing as long as the internet remains the main way people meet, which I don't see why that won't simply kind of fall back into place when this is over. I mean, just to be clear, my book, Modern, which is a kind of slightly fuzzy term, but it's a sort of pre-internet history. So the kind of how some of the social forces that now govern kind of much looser ideas about romance and love and the connection with marriage and responsibility and stuff, how those came into train, late 60s, early 70s, and how the internet and some of the sort of, even some of the dynamics of Tinder pick up on those older forces. But I think this marketization idea has been a sort of source of concern for a few hundred years, and I think that these are sort of just embedded ways that we approach
So you're not worried by the direction of travel. Do you,
in general, or because of the coronavirus?
no, prior. I mean, do you think we've gone too far in the kind of love market direction?
Yeah. Again, we've always been far in the love market. The way the marriage market is a term that was coined by an economist called Gary Becker decades ago. In the 19th century, there were parodies about the way the upper classes sort of basically held wife auctions and things. I mean, so am I concerned? I think, as I say, so I don't think the marketization thing is particularly new or gonna change, but I do have some concerns about some of the just the dynamics that emerge from the sheer churn and volume that sort of things like Tinder produces.
So the idea there is that you sort of, if you're swiping left or swiping right or whichever it is, there's a kind of superficiality to it, or that.
Well, it's just I don't even think it's about.
You don't need to invest in somebody.
Again, I don't think it's about superficial. I think it's about just this psychological effect of the illusion of that much choice. So whereas, even in the 70s, okay, people were beginning to place thousands of ads in Time Out, or there were computer dating companies like Dateline, which were pairing, feeding hundreds and thousands, thousands, let's say, of people. But it was still, considered quite lucky to get a match and a date, and you'd get excited about it, and even if it was horrible. But now it's the sheer volume. There's a sense that, it might be more worth your time just to stay at home and pick your nose or play video games or something, a date, a woman, who cares? So, and I think that's just simply a result of the sense that there's so many, you have so much. The reality is that you don't actually have that much choice.
David, we can David in.
What an omission.
An active online data for much of the last 18 months. And this kind of notion of marketization seems to me completely wrong. I mean, I'm not buying people online. It's just another way of meeting people. I mean, to the extent it's marketized, all forms of relationships are marketized. It's about, presenting yourself in the most attractive way to somebody else, whether you meet them online or whether you meet them in the pub. So
isn't there
the concept of marketization seems to be completely wrong. What I think the problem is with online dating is the sort of cornucopia idea, the idea that you meet someone really quite nice, but there's always someone better around the corner. You can always you can always go online tomorrow evening and find someone just slightly better. When that I think is a rather sort of corrupting aspect of it. Yeah.
I mean, just to be clear, I mean, I think the market thing is a very persistent metaphor, and I actually did a MPhil examining the degree to which it is actually accurate. And as you say, it's not like a market, because what online daters know immediately is that you're not picking a shirt off a rack. That so-called object has, completely, they can reject you. So it's not, as you say, it ceases to be like shopping for inanimate objects as soon as you start doing it. But I think, yes, I think you're right. The sense of there always being something better around the corner that you can upgrade is a bit of a consumer mentality.
So I'm now in a slightly unwieldy way going to try and tie this all together in a beautiful synthesis, because what we started talking about in the beginning was the question of whether kind of community and neighborhoods and sort of the opposite of globalization will be an effect of this. If one applies that to online dating, what about those relationships and those relations that aren't chosen or happen by, the accident of living next door, or the accident of being part of the same group, or the same area? All of those kind of different types of relationships are kind of superseded by the online dating world, aren't they? It is a kind of atomized kind of existence where everyone is a floating profile and they can just match like atoms to another profile. So is there not a sense in which, it's the opposite of a communitarian kind of world. If everyone is just a floating profile and can match with anyone else in any part of the world.
No.
Okay.
Another way of meeting people. I mean, but I mean, what you're talking about, I think, applies. I mean, if you don't mind me just taking the subject briefly away from Zoe's book. I mean, Ed wrote a little piece about this the other day, that this is the first really deep crisis of a multicultural, multi-ethnic Britain, and indeed Europe, and the extent to which it kind of, how much of it brings us together, the sort of, the Dunkirk spirit, the fact that, at a time when we have a kind of common enemy, lots of social divisions, whether it's social class or ethnicity, tend to recede as we all sort of see what we have in common with each other. I mean, on the other hand, this is, we are literally retreating into our shells. We're ordered to retreat into our shells, and that reinforces, more kind of parochial attachments. So, I mean, I think both things can happen at the same time. I mean, Robert Putnam's famous distinction between bridging social capital and what was the other one? Bonding social capital. I mean, it's what we're experiencing at the moment is kind of both of them at the same time. And it'll be very interesting to see how that aspect of the crisis plays out.
Great. Okay, everybody, we've been going for half an hour, and that is our time limit. I'm going to ask Liz and Zoe if you have any concluding thoughts for us before we sign off on this episode. Let's go to Liz.
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about what Zoe said, and I think it's fascinating. There is a poem doing the rounds, which I read out on a podcast this week, called Pandemic. And one of the lines in it is, touch only those to whom you have committed your life. And I think that's really resonating with me, that are the commitments that we make. And I think all of the world's faith traditions, when it comes to relationships, would want to put a high value on commitment and covenant and long term, whether that's, friends, lovers, whatever it is. And I wonder if that sense of it is revealing to us who we have committed our lives to right now, whether that might change the landscape going forward.
Because actually there's just a very simple point to make here about physical, the way viruses are transmitted, being deprived of all touch for an indefinite period of time is a serious obstacle in the journey towards love, I would say. And the daters that I studied in the 1970s were often crippled by loneliness. People were very concerned about loneliness. It was becoming a sort of, they were actually calling it an epidemic, or it was very much pathologized all the time. But at least they could, as could we until about a month ago, kind of see what came along, have those experiences, not have to think in the extreme ways, the interesting ways you're talking about, the extreme ways about the cost of touch. And I think we're completely ill-equipped to be thinking about the cost of touch in those terms. And also, I'm very grateful that we've come to a point where we don't need to, where intimacy isn't freighted in that way. It's not life and death anymore. It shouldn't be, but now it is. So I think that's the serious obstacle. And
thanks, Zoe. I hear you, and I think that's a really important pastoral point in all the ways we talk about this, like the loneliness and the mental health cost that all this will be bringing.
Everybody, thank you so much. Thank you to Liz, thank you to David, and thank you to Zoe. I should say that the wonderful Polly Mackenzie was going to join us, but we couldn't get the sound working, so hopefully we'll get her on another day. You have been watching Lockdown TV, day number 3 of lockdown. This is where we try and think about the bigger thoughts which are going to happen coming out of this crisis on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So do tune in every day, 4 p.m. every weekday. See you next time.